Yeah, I've been looking at the South African scenario. I was out in South Africa end of 1980, so I was working there for, during the apartheid period, and was there through the process of the first democracy that came to South Africa in the 90s as well. But I remember a very crucial time in 1985. And I guess then I would have described myself as liberal-minded. I was there, I was from the UK, so I kept in touch with UK values, and at the same time was busy working in South Africa as a white South African, no, not South African, as a white person. So I had I emigrated there, and I had a job there, and I had a career there, and did very well there in helping and developing businesses. Had a lot of friends, white friends, black friends, coloured friends, Indian friends. I was there during the embargoes against South Africa, the sanctions, when basically the world sanctioned South Africa and it was on its own, had to make its decisions, and the world was very much against the whole apartheid rule, which was deemed as very ugly. And I've got to say, being more liberal-minded, I was also of the view that it would change, and it would change for the better in the long run. And this is before Nelson Mandela was released. This was in the early days. P.W. Botha was the president of South Africa, and I can remember when I think the country was in state of emergency, and yes, it was in state of emergency. The world was really putting South Africa under pressure to make reforms and change things, and it was 1985. P.W. Botha made a famous speech in Durban, I think it was. My South African friends will correct me, but I'm sure, if I remember, it was Durban. And in this speech that was being televised, that we knew this speech was going to be televised. We knew this speech was going to be an important change. And I think the world and many people were expecting P.W. Botha to respond to the reforms, respond to changes in a way that we thought was as the world wished. As de Klerk made changes many years later. But Botha totally surprised everybody, the world and everybody else, and made the point. It became known as the Rubicon speech, the point of no return. And he made that point. South Africa had reached a point in its history where it could not make the change. It had to continue its current onward journey with the way ruling South Africa could only work if it was going to be a successful country, a rich country, a country that could not only look after its people, but do things, be a world leader in its production of gold and agriculture and other minerals as well. And it was a country that had a lot of potential, even though it was being heavily sanctioned at the time. But he made the point that it was, being Africa and people not understanding Africa in other parts of the world, it had to be a decision taken by him and the government to actually go this route. So it was a very significant position that he took. Obviously, we know what happened. He eventually lost control, was ousted by F.W. de Klerk, who was more liberal. I wouldn't say he was liberal, but he was more liberal-minded than P.W. Botha. I think P.W. Botha's health was also playing a part. And in the end, the rest is history, as they say. The ANC became a legalized party. They were unbanned, and as was the Communist Party. Nelson Mandela and others were released from prison, and the reforms kicked in, and Mandela made that pledge to be careful with, he went on a world tour. Before he was president, he went on a world tour and did a lot of wooing the world, the Americans, the British, all the Europe, everywhere, to ensure that there wasn't going to be any problems and people needn't worry about getting their money out of the country. It's going to be all fine and it's all going to be okay, hunky-dory, as they say. And it was the time of the, what do they call it, the Rainbow Nation, as it was becoming. And I was there in that period, so I went through that process of change that took place in South Africa from the apartheid years in the early 80s, let's call it, through to when it eventually collapsed with the hostilities of the world and the sanctions to the Rainbow Nation, as it was. And I left South Africa during that, in that period of time as well. Mandela was then president. I was there for a year or two when he was president, 2 years after he became president. And then I left. The country was kind of going through this change. There was investment coming into the country. There was things that were happening that were more realistic in terms of how that was going. But now, and I don't want to go through a history of South Africa, but I look at South Africa today and my liberal views totally change. I sort of think the points that P.W. Botha was making back in 1985, of how right he was about, and his views on South Africa. If you listen to his speech, find it on YouTube and listen to it, you'll hear clearly his point, his views, and how, as a result of the changes in the ANC, over the years, been governing South Africa. And let's be realistic, it's 30 years since the apartheid has diminished nearly. And it is it's 30 years, isn't it? Yeah. It's a significant change of government in how they think now as a government, and how wrong they are. And it's not a question of black people are wealthier or better off. Yes, there are some wealthy black people. There was, there's no doubt about it. They have opportunities, some. The privileged few black people get good education and get the best jobs and get the best and do those jobs and earn good salaries, as do government officials, it seems, because of their corruption of the government, the current government anyway. But actually, for majority of people, they're in a worse state. You can't say that majority of people, I'm not talking about white people. Of course white people are suffering now, and many have left. Those that can leave have left. Those that can't leave stay there and suffer. But the point is, it's a cock-up. And from what I can see, the situation is deteriorated over 30 years. Apartheid is being used, the race card is being used as a means of why the country is in its current state. And it's absolute rubbish. It's total rubbish. You know, if you look at other countries in Africa, across Africa, I'm not saying they are well managed, but you know, the race card dropped many yonks ago, years ago. Independence has been, and governments come and go. You know, you get reasonably good countries that are okay, and you get others that are disastrous as a result of the corruption in a lot of African countries. Some are better than others. I mean, my old school friend Melville Thomas, he will obviously talk to me about what I'm saying now with interest, and talk about his own country, Sierra Leone, and how that has, you know, had so many corrupt governments over the years that have screwed the country in many respects. And there are many countries like that. You know, there are also success stories. There's also successful African countries, but very few. But they aren't as bad as South Africa. What they aren't doing is the race card keeps on getting put on the table. It's no longer that. In South Africa, it's just gone one way. It's got worse year after year after year after year after year. And it's reached this stage of total decay. We're fooling ourselves. And the world is in a position now where liberalization is also not working. So that's why many governments are going more right-wing. If you look at European countries, more and more right-wing movements are taking control. You know, Germany, Italy. Look at where France is heading. You know, Macron won't be there for long. It's going to be the same. And in the UK, okay, we've got the Labour Party, so what a screw up they're doing. What a mess. They want to negotiate with everything. And, you know, I think people have realised now you can't negotiate with dictators. You can't negotiate with aggressors. You have to play them at their own game. You know, you can't. Diplomacy works to a point, but it's diplomacy with force. And we should know that. We should know that. Of course, we've got to ensure everyone is protected. Of course, we've got to ensure that we protect minorities. I have no issues about that part of liberalising the thinking, but we have to do it with an iron fist. We can't allow shit like Putin to come in and dictate to us, and we just softly negotiate with them. These are the kind of things we've got to be up against. And any dictator, whether he's a large influential dictator like Putin, or whether he's an African leader sitting in a small country environment, we don't allow those sort of people. We've got to be firm, and this is why the world is going more right-wing. And that's the way I see it, and I can understand why. And to an extent now, I agree with it. You know, I think we've got to be firmer in our understanding with things going on around it. If we want to protect our freedom and our democracy, we have to be tough. South Africa has fallen into the wrong people. Have been in power for too long, decades. They've been in power for decades and failed miserably. And they can't afford to wait any longer. The next election is too far away. You know, there needs to be change now, otherwise it's going to be a total F-up in the economy of South Africa. It already is. But the leadership, the government, the authority, the process has to change and has to change now.